Friedrich Nietzsche occupied a central position during one of the most transformative moments in Western history. Anticipating both the causes and consequences of this turning point, he proposed revolutionary ideas as solutions to the challenges he perceived. Nietzsche stood out at a time when the foundations of Western religious faith began to crumble, leaving an existential void. At the end of this collapse, it seemed that only pessimism and nihilism remained as responses to the inherent suffering of life. However, Nietzsche's work did not resign itself to this dichotomy. He sought an alternative that rejected both religious dogma and nihilism, charting a path toward new human meanings and values. Born in 1844 in Saxony, a region that is now part of Germany, Nietzsche grew up in a modest family and had a relatively ordinary childhood. His father, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, which introduced young Friedrich very early on to Christianity. However, the faith he was raised in was soon put to the test. Nietzsche's father, the very man who preached the Word of God, was diagnosed with a severe brain illness. After a year of intense suffering, he died at the age of 35, leaving a deeply affected young Nietzsche. As if that were not enough, the following year his younger brother Ludwig also died, marking a period of grief and loss that would undoubtedly influence the philosopher's worldview. The tension between the religious faith that marked his childhood and the inexplicable suffering he witnessed from a young age seems to have been one of the fundamental pillars of the philosophy Nietzsche would later develop. His youth was marked by a somber and serious loneliness that led him to study theology at the University of Bonn. Nietzsche always showed a promising intellect, standing out especially in Christian studies. However, after only one semester, his growing critical thinking and exposure to various schools of thought that challenged Christianity led him to deeply question his faith. Eventually, he completely abandoned his religious beliefs, breaking with the innocence and devotion that had once guided him. After that rupture, Nietzsche shifted to philology, the study of language and its evolution, at the University of Leipzig. His performance was so remarkable that, still in his 20s, he was invited to hold a chair in classical philology at the University of Basel, becoming the youngest professor in the institution's history. However, the initial enthusiasm soon gave way to frustration. Nietzsche began to feel constrained by the academic environment, and his health also began to deteriorate severely, suffering from various chronic illnesses and possibly a syphilis infection. He was forced to abandon teaching. From then on, Nietzsche led a nomadic and solitary life, traveling throughout Europe in search of climates that might ease his frail health. He spent much of this period in the Swiss Alps, where, despite recurring episodes of illness and personal disappointments, including unrequited love and the severing of ties with friends and family, he found solace in reflection and writing. It was during these years of isolation that he produced some of his most important works. These include Human, All Too Human, The Joyous Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and The Genealogy of Morality. In these works, Nietzsche deeply questioned the certainties of his time, challenging established concepts of morality, truth, and falsehood. He proclaimed, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" This radical provocation dismantled traditional notions of right and wrong, laying the foundations for a new philosophy that questioned all absolute truths, forcing humanity to find new paths to meaning and morality. This quote, "God is dead," is one of Nietzsche's most well-known and fundamental. Far from being a celebration of humanity's loss of faith, it contains a profound warning. Nietzsche saw the collapse of Christian belief as the collapse of the entire moral and value structure that Europe had built over the centuries. He feared that, without a suitable replacement for that foundation, humanity would be left without a coherent system of meaning, plunging into a state of despair and emptiness, which would lead to nihilism. For Nietzsche, the solution to this deadlock lay in recognizing that there is no objective universal truth. By asserting that there are no facts, only interpretations, he challenged the very idea of absolute truths, suggesting that such pursuits were illusory and actually distanced modern man from any genuine possibility of finding meaning in life. The insistence on universal objectivity, or a meaning that transcended earthly life, he believed, diverted people from the richness of human experience, which is inherently subjective and individual. With this in mind, Nietzsche began to value the arts and the humanities, believing that creative expressions such as music, literature, theater, and philosophy could be essential tools for conveying deeper truths and giving life meaning in a world devoid of absolute certainties. However, Nietzsche also recognized the risks involved. He perceived that these cultural expressions could become sterile, academic, or commercialized, thereby losing their ability to genuinely touch the human spirit. For him, art had to be alive, immersive, and deeply connected with emotion and subjectivity, capable of filling the void left by the death of faith and restoring a connection with the meaning of existence. From that point forward, Nietzsche focused his attention on building a philosophy that placed the individual at the center, liberating them from dependence on collective or cultural conventions. He argued that each person must seek their own creative and subjective expression, becoming responsible for creating their own meaning. This concept culminated in the idea of the Übermensch, or Superman, which he first presented in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Übermensch is a bold, self-sufficient individual, firm in their convictions, who pursues their goals with vigor and courage, without apologizing or submitting to collective norms. This figure exalts strategic selfishness and acts with assertiveness and greatness, unafraid to break with established patterns. Nietzsche believed that this new morality was necessary to challenge the old beliefs rooted in Christianity, which, according to him, celebrated weakness and humility. Instead, he proposed a morality more aligned with true human nature, characterized by the desire for power, vitality, and greatness. Although the concept of the Übermensch has been subject to misunderstandings and criticism, its deeper meaning goes beyond the literal image of a superior being. The Übermensch, for Nietzsche, represented an idealized version of each individual, a figure who has overcome all fears and weaknesses, someone we must aspire to become. Though it is an unattainable ideal, that is precisely the point. Nietzsche suggested that the world, including human beings, is driven by what he called the will to power, an inherent desire in all living beings to assert and expand their power. The world is will to power, and nothing besides. This will to power does not only refer to physical strength or control over others, but above all to power over oneself. For Nietzsche, true personal growth comes from psychological and spiritual development, achieved through self-mastery and continuous progress. This alignment with the will to power, therefore, represents the highest harmony an individual can reach with life in their own existence. The pursuit of the ideal of the Übermensch serves as a constant drive for personal development as the individual enters a continuous cycle of dissatisfaction, self-improvement, and rediscovery. Nietzsche called this process self-overcoming, an essential path to finding meaning and value in life. For him, true human growth arises when suffering is transformed into a life-affirming force. This transformation is a kind of spiritual alchemy, where the inevitable pain of existence becomes a factor of personal redemption. As Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anything." Unlike Schopenhauer, who saw suffering as something that should be avoided whenever possible, Nietzsche believed suffering was necessary and should be confronted directly. He saw it as an opportunity to gain psychological strength and inner power. For Nietzsche, the issue was not suffering itself, but the absence of meaning in suffering. The lack of meaning in suffering, not the suffering itself, has been humanity's curse up to now, he stated. Thus, the key to living fully was to find a purpose that would justify and give meaning to pain. As Nietzsche became increasingly isolated in the mountains, working on his most ambitious philosophical projects, he began to show signs of mental decline. At the age of 44, in a moment that would mark the beginning of his downfall, he witnessed a horse being beaten by its owner in the street. Nietzsche ran to the animal, hugged it, and cried out while shouting, "I understand you! I understand you!" This gesture, which seemed to contradict his own ideas about strength and greatness, revealed a deep compassion and empathy, signs of a mind on the verge of collapse. Shortly after this incident, Nietzsche succumbed to irreversible madness. Entering a state of catatonia, the brilliant mind that had challenged the world with its ideas seemed to have disintegrated under the weight of its own intensity. Whether this madness was caused by physical illnesses he contracted or by the impact of his deeply introspective mind remains a mystery. Nietzsche died in 1900 at the age of 55, the victim of a stroke, leaving behind a legacy that still resonates in modern thought. During his lifetime, Nietzsche, by his own standards, might be seen as a failure. Before his mental health deteriorated, he did not achieve great success and saw little, if any, acceptance of his work. His books had insignificant sales, and he never attained considerable recognition or respect. However, after his death, his work gradually gained prominence, becoming recognized and admired by a vast audience around the world. Unfortunately, part of this legacy was distorted and misinterpreted, resulting in misguided applications of his ideas. Despite this, Nietzsche's impact remains deeply rooted in modern thought. His phrases and aphorisms continue to resonate in culture, both literally and symbolically. There is a certain irony in the fact that Nietzsche advocated the necessity of a symbolic death throughout life, a process through which we must liberate ourselves in order to truly become ourselves, often sacrificing our health or well-being in the name of something greater. Perhaps Nietzsche's very life and death represent that process of self-overcoming, a personal sacrifice for a higher purpose. Still, his ideas, especially about self-overcoming and sacrifice in pursuit of greatness, are not free from criticism. Although he accurately diagnosed many of modernity's problems, his solutions are not always universal. Is constant suffering and the relentless pursuit of an unreachable goal really beneficial? How can someone view this process as something positive if they don't perceive it that way? And most importantly, how can a person create a life-affirming meaning if their own view of existence is negative or devoid of meaning? In other words, if someone sees life as empty or meaningless, the search for goals and interpretations that give meaning to existence may be futile, leaving that person trapped in the need to find something beyond themselves that is not within reach. And if one rejects the initial premise that suffering is good for progress, the rest of Nietzsche's ideas may seem like a detour or a failed justification. Of course, Nietzsche was a philosopher whose ideas often defied linearity and in some cases seem contradictory. This makes his work open to various interpretations. Most importantly, His philosophy does not seek to impose a specific way of thinking, but rather to encourage each individual to find their own path. In that sense, even if we disagree with Nietzsche, he leaves us with the same freedom he granted himself, the freedom to chart a new course for our lives according to our own perspectives. Do you know what bothers me? Feeling lonely and not having anyone to talk to. So, if you like philosophy, I invite you to be part of the channel and be part of our community. We are always exploring new ideas, questioning concepts, and delving into issues that challenge the way we see the world. Every subscription makes a huge difference and helps keep these philosophical conversations alive.